Hello and welcome back to the channel. Another Sunday, another video. Today we will be talking about detail that I've been asked by Olia a number of times, and as she put it before once, when I try to answer a question, she forgets the answer immediately. And half an hour later, I'm asked exactly the same question. Okay, I'm exaggerating. Maybe not another half hour, but let's say a day or two later, I definitely will be asked exactly the same question yet again. So, following her idea, she said, when I am editing a video, I remember what you have said. When you just answer my question, comes and goes. Many comments come to mind. I should be polite and not use any of them. So, without further ado, today we shall be talking. Having said all this, this may be the last video in which you see me alive. Returning to the ship, today we will be talking about bridle ports and guns in the extremities of the vessel. I know what she wants me to say, which is going to have only a passing resemblance to what I'm actually going to be talking about. But let's go for it. In the early days of the development of the sailing man of war, cannon-armed sailing man of war, the tactics of fighting at sea required a vessel to be, to use the contemporary word, first and foremost, nimble. This meant that the approach was the vessel will approach the enemy ship, bow on, and fire the guns that point forwards. Then it will turn and fire one broadside. Then it will continue your turn and fire the stern chasers. Then will offer the second broadside, and by then, of course, the bow guns presumably have reloaded and can be used again. Early on, just as with galleys, which probably were the first vessels to carry heavy artillery to sea, we do know from archaeology and from other sources that by the mid-15th century, galleys certainly carried heavy bombarders firing forward. There was a wreck found off the Israeli coast that certainly shows this arrangement, and very likely it may have happened even earlier than this. Sailing vessels were latecomers to the joy of artillery. The problem with this, of course, is that, especially with the sailing ship, really your might is on the side. And early on, the concentration of shipbuilders was how to position as many guns firing forward as is humanly possible. And that is where you see the vertical flat bulkheads, beakhead bulkheads emerging on multi-decked ships of war. Because the vessel had to be armed as heavily forward and aft as is humanly possible, following the traditional tactics, that is why you started seeing chase guns in 2 or 3, depending how many decks the vessel had, firing straight forward. On a 3-decker, you would have at least 6 guns pointing forward, possibly 2 additional on the top of the forecastle. And gradually, as the rigging of the bow changed, as the height of the forecastle changed, as construction of vessels, and most importantly, as tactics began to change in the middle of the 17th century and shifted towards broadside, the effort being on the broadside rather than fore and aft, and the ships fighting in organized way in a line of battle, not as individual powerful vessels supported by a few smaller ones in groups, then you begin to see drift away from the multiple forward firing guns, because this began to be less of an issue. It was no longer needed. It's always nice to have a few chase guns forward in case you're chasing something, or in case you have an opportunity, or defensive measures to prevent others from boarding your ship from that direction. But by and large, this is no longer the emphasis that it had in earlier times. So with this, the flat, high bulkheads begin to disappear. the planking of the bow started being raised higher and higher until, for all practical purposes, the bulkhead was diminished only to the uppermost levels of the beakhead, and the rest would be the round bows. In this context comes the ports that nowadays we know as bridle-ports. I'm not quite sure when the term emerged, but probably was already in use by the 18th century. I have not seen many 17th century documents that speak of bridle-ports in these words, but I do see them referring to guns that can be shifted into these ports and to fire forward. So once the bulkhead and the multiple tiers of guns in the bulkhead was gone from the vessel, how do you solve the problem firing directly forward? Of course, the one option is by positioning guns on the forecastle. But all the rigging, especially with the emergence of the jibs and staysails, they're in the way. The other thing is that on the forecastle you have only very light guns. Light guns have some usage, especially in close quarters fighting, but they do not carry very far and they're not particularly accurate over great distances. So you have to sort this one out somehow. Hence the bridle-port. This is a gunport that quite often on most ships, actually most of the time, was left empty. The reason behind it is that, as you can see, the bridle-port is coinciding with a very busy area on the main deck of a vessel. This is where the riding bits are. This cuts down dramatically on the space available, the room available for the gun to recoil and for the people who are servicing this gun. Let's not forget that the 36 to 40 pounder is going to have somewhere in the vicinity of 14 to 16 men serving the gun. And this is not even taking into account the monkey boys running back and forth with ammunition. This is just the manpower needed to shift the gun in and out of the port. So there simply was not enough room. If the situation really required you to fire forward, then one of the forward guns could fairly easily and quickly be shifted into the bridle-port, and yet once you have caught up with your prey, you could return it back on the broadside. Another shortcoming of the bridle-port, of course, is that it cannot actually fire towards the broadside, so it is not contributing under normal battle conditions. It is only in the very specific cases of chasing. That's why, especially on smaller vessels, frigates, etc., it is rare to see every single gunport carrying a gun. Another issue, of course, is that usually, especially in the 17th century, vessels had varying ammunition, varying artillery aboard. And you can see this in most of the lists of the Navy from this period. They're going to give you a range of guns, and the tables usually go along the lines of service in peace at home waters, service abroad, service in home waters at war, which usually was the highest number of guns, the maximum. Pretty much wherever you could, you would cram guns. And then, of course, there is finally service abroad. For service abroad, especially in the 17th century, you see that the total artillery is decreased by usually 2 to 4 guns. This is both to lighten the ship, of course, to decrease the quantity of ammunition that had to be carried, but mostly it was to lighten the ship and make the bows rise to the ocean waves lighter, easier than they would otherwise. Especially since in the 17th century, we see much sharper lines in the bow and in the stern of the vessel than we do by the 18th century. That perhaps is a subject of a different video, however, on changing of design of vessels, and it's essentially function of the usage of the fleet. So that is what really, how did this conversation begin in the first place? Well, the BOREAS. Whoever modeled the ship back in whenever the model was actually built, probably 30, 40, 50 years ago, who knows? Every single gunport carries a gun. We do know that she was 8 and 20, 6th-rate frigate. Therefore, she would have been commanded by a full captain post captain, not by a master and commander, as some popular films have suggested. And she most definitely will carry at least a pair of guns fewer than the model actually has. For that, we have the list of the artillery that she carried. So the most probable place where you would not have a gun is actually the bridle-port. The bridle-port, of course, was used for many different things. You could carry out cable out through there. Bridle, that's where it comes from. You can position a bridle so that the ship can be towed through there, those ports. Although that, of course, forward could be carried out also through the hose holes in the more convenient way. With this, I think that we can bring this little video to a lame conclusion. I thank you for watching. Thank you very much for liking, commenting. And while we're on the subject, if you have any suggestions for things that you would like to hear me talk about, please do not hesitate to list them down in the comments, and I will see what I can do about it. I also would like to take this moment to thank to one of the particularly generous viewers of this channel who has been sponsoring the channel. Thank you so much. It is deeply appreciated. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a most wonderful rest of your Sunday. See you next time.